Good day, and welcome to Lecture 6 in Theology and Humor Throughout Church History. Now, last week we looked at the Gospels. We looked at the humor in the Gospels of how Mark associated food with comedy. And we even find some stories and incidents like the man born blind that have comic elements to it. But what we've learned at the beginning is that even though God may have created laughter as a good thing, a good and natural thing, the fall happened and laughter becomes sour. So now we look at what is going on in the Gospels. And the first thing we realize is that Jesus has 12 followers. But the next thing we find is that as they're the followers, they're just the disciples. This is going to take us next to a chart that really shows us the problem. When Jesus begins, he attracts all kinds of people. They enjoy his teaching. They love his miracles. They love his stories and parables. But as it goes along, he begins to alienate certain people who want to be God themselves. What we see is that the resistance of the authorities, of scribes, communicators, religious leaders, Pharisees, and lawyers to what Jesus is saying. And when that begins to happen, we find that the danger comes when people become angry with Jesus and they begin to attack him. Now, after the Last Supper, he meets with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he's arrested. And then he's taken before Pilate and before the crowd, and they say, crucify him. What this leads to is one of the most negative kinds of laughter that we find throughout Scripture, and that is mocking. So the next thing we see is a series of these images. We find that blasphemy and mocking come together. They believe that Jesus, by saying that he is the Son of God, that he is equal with God, is something that is so blasphemous, so they begin to mock him. But Jesus said, I and the Father are one. And that's when the religious leaders and the Jews took up stones to stone him. And Jesus answered them, I showed you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you stoning me? And they answered him, for a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, have made yourself out to be like God, to be God. The next thing we find throughout history is that artists have captured these moments that come after his arrest. For example, Giotto looks at the mocking of Christ and flagellation, where they begin to whip him and scourge him. And they wag their heads and saying, it's like, aha, we've got you. The next one is coming from Fra Angelica in the 15th century. And we have this kind of detail of a man spitting at Jesus and hands that are out there slapping him. And it comes from the passage in Matthew where Matthew records, then they spat in his face and they beat him with their fists and others slapped him. And they said, prophesy to us, O Christ, who is the one who hit you? When you're blindfolded, you can't tell. And so this mocking continues even into the next image where Hieronymus Bosch gives us this kind of grotesque image of what happens with laughter. That laughter becomes corrupt and ruined and ugly. What is inside of a person becomes revealed. What is whispered among these men is going to be shouted from the housetops. And the hearts of darkness that we see in all of ourselves begins to come out when God says, this is my son, follow him, obey him. Now the next image takes us to Christ carrying the cross, and Hieronymus Bosch again gets this, and it leads us to certain terms that help us to understand what this mocking is like. The Latin word for Matthew and Mark is blasphemio, which basically means to blaspheme, to revile. But Luke uses another word, which is exmasterizo. And basically, ek is out of, and it's out of the nose. It's sneering. It's this kind of evil look that you give, and you turn your face up. And you can look at some of the kind of grotesque characters that Bosch has created in his painting here. And their large noses gives you the sense of sneering, of looking down at. But the next one is Stomer in the 17th century, and it gives us some other ideas of the words and how we visualize them. Illudo, a Latin word for mock, is kind of a bad play. Ludo is the word for play. And it's a playing with, but it's an evil playing. It's a twisted play that is there. You amuse yourself with someone else, taking advantage of them and ridiculing them. The Greek word is empazio, which means to trifle with and to scoff. And so we get a sense of how these people are treating Jesus. And it is with laughter, but it is with a laughter that has been distorted and twisted. It is a laughter that comes from a very dark heart. Now, the next and the last one is Matthew Grunwald, in which he shows the mocking of Christ, which occurs with not only this kind of verbal bullying, but the physical bullying as well. And in his book, M.A. Screech, The Laughter of the Foot at the Cross, talks about the presence of sin in our laughter, that we have to watch how we bully others and how we are flippant with others. And so this kind of cruelty comes not only physically, but also verbally. The next one is Lucas Cranach, who was one of the great artists of the Reformation. And how he creates kind of the scene out of the Reformation there, where one laughs at one's enemies and it's sweet to them. They enjoy it. And you see two of the characters that Cranach has kind of painted on the left side with their tongues wagging again. And the wagging of the tongues, la, 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 just the mocking that is there is kind of a cruel thing. But Jesus comes along, and to these enemies who are brutally beating him and verbally ridiculing him, he says, forgive them. They know not what they do. And it is one of the most difficult times when you realize that you have been attacked over and over again and been reviled, that you say, forgive them. Now, what that leads us finally to is this idea in Christ crowned with thorns. We find the brutes are really facing us with a smirk. And the laughter directed at the Christ on the cross is deeply disturbing because it involves us. The character in this painting is looking at us and calling us to join in him. And what this goes back to is an amazing story by Gary Kilworth. It's kind of a science fiction time travel story called Let's Go to Golgotha. And in the story, Let's Go Golgotha, there's a family, and the family is deciding where to time travel to. Do they want to go to Pompeii and see the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, or where do they want to go? And so they're kind of bored. So they say, well, why don't we go back to Jerusalem in 33 AD and go to the crucifixion and see what's going on there? So they're put into kind of the garb of the time. They wear the same kind of costumes, and they have to fit in. They have the same kind of hair. Everything else is fixed up so they just will blend in. And they get there, and they're in Jerusalem, and they're milling with the crowds, and all of a sudden they see Pilate up there, and he has this man who has a crown of thorns on his head. And he's up there and he says, well, what then shall I do with this Jesus? And the crowd begins to shout, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And they're all going there. And the family is there, and they're watching all this go on. And finally they get caught up in it. They go, crucify him. Yeah, crucify him, crucify him. And suddenly it occurs to them that they have just called for the crucifixion of Jesus. And they look around and they realize another truth, that everyone there is a tourist from the future, that all of them have called for Christ to be crucified. And what Kilworth has done in this story is invited us in and made us realize that we too are guilty with these first century attackers and accusers and mockers of Jesus. So it's a wonderful kind of ironic satire of what is going on. Now we move from that kind of dark mocking to finding next some inside jokes that happen in the Gospels. And this is where I may be speculating here, but I think it's worthwhile, where we see the authors of the Gospels showing themselves, kind of hinting that I was there. For example, in the Garden of Gethsemane, in the Gospel of Mark, it writes, and there was one young man following Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him, but he left the linen sheet behind and he ran away naked. This is probably Mark saying, I was there. I was a young man. I had been following Peter. I would record Peter's stories later on for my gospel, but I knew all these stories, but I was there. But it was one of my most embarrassing and shameful moments as well, because I was naked and I was getting out of there as fast as I could. Now, the next one we find another author, the kind of beloved disciple John, writes about how Peter and another saint ran to the sepulcher. They ran to the tomb when they heard what the women had said about the resurrection. Both were running, But the other disciple, whom Jesus loved, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Now, in my imagination, I see John saying, look, Peter may be the one who goes to Rome and builds a church there, but I was faster. I was much faster. I was younger. I was in better shape than Peter, the kind of fat fisherman. And so he's kind of playing with this, and he says, these two are running. And he adds this little detail, the fact that I was faster. And he writes the narrative to kind of show off this one little moment. Now, the next thing is we recognize that the Gospels go from looking at Mary at the tomb and saying, why are you weeping? And the sorrow that is so deep and so pervasive in all of the disciples and the women, to this deep comedy of the resurrection. The resurrection changes everything. If there were no resurrection, the Apostle Paul says, then we of all men are to be pitied. We have nothing. This is the crux and the core of everything we believe, that these witnesses who saw the resurrection were true and credible. And so the church fathers, even those whom we'll see next week, have problems with laughter, kinds of laughter, like Gregory of Nyssa, the great Cappadocian father, or John Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed preacher from Constantinople. They believed that God had played a joke on the devil by raising Jesus from the dead. Satan thought he had won, but he hadn't. It's this great joke, this great, what the church fathers call the risus paschalis, the Easter laugh. And the Easter laugh is God's joyous laughter over triumphing over death and sin. Death and sin, the powers are gone no more. They've lost their sting. They've lost their power. And as Luther quipped, wherever there is faith in the resurrection, there is also laughter. And so after all of this mocking and scoffing and sneering, we have this joyous laughter, this laughter of the resurrection, which you have to laugh at. The next thing we find is that there is kind of a breakout comedy at the resurrection. And this is the fact that Jesus allows the first witnesses at the tomb to be women. Next week, we'll look at this skeptic and this cynic whose name is Celsus. And Celsus says one of the problems of the story of Jesus in the Gospels is that they make such incredible and uncredible witnesses as women. Women had no credibility whatsoever. If you wanted your story to be credible, you had to have a man, and particularly an older man, a man of the Sanhedrin, kind of testify to the evidence. Women were not considered credible witnesses. But Jesus turns that on its head. And in the Gospels, it's the women who always see it. And Peter and the other disciples, when they find out that there was a resurrection, they just say, it was just as the women said. What can we say about this? And so this wonderful comedy of women being the ones to whom God reveals himself first, over and over again comes up. In fact, the next time we see it is that we don't realize how exciting it is to find an unexpected life where we thought there was dead. And so even in this kind of comic illustration, we realize the great startling wonder of the resurrection, of new life that comes in. But next we see the two disciples are on the way to Emmaus. And as they're walking to Emmaus, a stranger joins them. And they're kind of going over the stories of everything that's gone on. And the stranger says, well, what are you talking about? And they talk to the stranger and they say, are you the only one who doesn't know all the things that have gone on these last couple days? And the stranger, whom we now know is Jesus, says, what things? It's what a great setup line. What things? What's going on? I don't know what's going on. He plays dumb. And so they begin to tell him everything. And then Jesus comes back and explains things. But then they go and they sit at an inn. And Jesus takes the bread and he breaks the bread. And when the bread is broken, they recognize that it is Jesus. And the disciples say, Cleopas and his friends say, it's just as the women had told us. And they run back to all the disciples in Jerusalem and they said, were not our hearts bursting with joy? And you can imagine them laughing and just joking and going over all of these stories again and saying, how did we not recognize that Jesus was among us? Emmanuel, God with us, was in the breaking of the bread. And here it gets back to the food. So this next thing, we have the story of the supper at Emmaus, which is an invitation for us to sit with other disciples and to tell these stories and to eat and to drink and to realize that in our saying of grace, that God is with us. That even as Elijah was at the Passover, Jesus is now with us. At every meal we take with one another, when we eat the bread and drink the wine, and we laugh and we rejoice and we tell the stories. Now, another kind of comic moment that happens after the resurrection is next when Jesus confronts Peter. And he's just called Peter out from fishing, and they're sitting around, they're having a fish fry. And Jesus asks him this question 3 times. He says, Peter, do you agapeo, which means this kind of sacrificial love, this love that goes beyond where you give yourself over to someone else, do you agapeo me? Do you love me more than these? And Peter's response is, yes, Lord, you know, oida, which means kind of a very factual knowledge. It's a knowledge by observation. You've seen that I phileo you. I'm your friend. I've been with you. I'm your friend. You know. And Jesus says, well, feed my lambs. But then Jesus comes back a little while later and says, Peter, do you agapeo me? Do you love me with this sacrificial love? You're ready to die for me. And Peter says, yes, Lord. You know, you recognize basically by observation that I phileo you. I'm your friend. And Jesus says, okay, shepherd my sheep. But then the 3rd time, Jesus comes, and now he comes down to Peter's level. And he says, Peter, do you phileo me? Do you love me? And Peter says, Lord, you know by observation, you know just by the evidence, all things. And now he used a different verb. You gnosko. You know me intimately. You know me by experience that I am your friend. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. And so you have this wonderful wordplay going on. First, we have the fact that Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. And now Jesus asked Peter if he loved him 3 times. He is erasing that past. He is showing forgiveness. He is showing grace. He is showing this agape love. And it's going to take Peter a while to really understand this agape love. But the love is there, this joyous love. And he says, you're not only going to know by the facts, by observation, but you're going to know by an experience. There is a time in which I was dating my wife, and I knew by observation that she was someone I wanted to love. And yet, by getting to know her, I knew her more and more, which leads us to kind of this next moment where after Jesus said, Peter, do you agapeo me? And Peter just says, I phileo you. It goes next to what I've asked my wife is, do you eroticate me? Which means, do you love me with eros? And she says, no, I phileo you. I phileo you. I could agapeo you. I could storge, kind of affection you, but not yet. Not yet with the eros. Let's get married first. And so I had to learn over and over again that the erosis did not come until later. Next, we go back to this ongoing theme of food and comedy. And it is after the resurrection and after the ascension that the disciples gather, and every day they meet together in the temple courts. And what do? They break bread. They have rockfish, and they have all kinds of delicacies. And they eat the bread in their homes with glad and sincere hearts. And this word glad is something that is kind of glaudia. It is full of joy. They praise God. They enjoy. And notice those words, glad and enjoyment, are there, and they're usually accompanied with laughter. The favor of all people. And the Lord adds to their number daily those who are being saved. That is there. It is a wonderful thing to see that is next there. Now, food comes as well in this next idea where Peter is very sleepy. He's just had his afternoon meal. He goes up on the rooftop to take a nap. And he was up in the city of Joppa praying, and then he fell asleep, and he had this vision. And in the vision, this large sheet descended from heaven with kind of 4 corners, and it came very close to Peter. And he looked at it closely, and he saw these 4-footed animals that he was not allowed to eat. They were non-kosher. There were beasts of prey, reptiles, and birds of the air. And he heard a voice saying to me, Peter, get up, go ahead and kind of barbecue this and eat. But I said, no, Lord, no means. I will not eat anything profane or unclean. I am a good kosher Jew. None of this has ever entered my mouth. But a second time, the Lord comes and says, what God has made clean, you must not call profane. This happens how many times? We see this ongoing repetition of the joke 3 times. It comes to Peter. Peter takes a while to learn. And so everything is there, and then it's finally pulled up to heaven. This gets us next to the kind of image of what were all these clean and unclean meats. We have all this unclean food, and it's not as if Jesus is really, or God is really telling Peter to change his diet, but he's preparing him to take in those things that are unclean into the community of faith. And that is the Gentile. Bring these Gentiles in, bring these dogs in, bring in these women, all these others that you have rejected. Do not call profane, because I have received them, I have blessed them, and I will make them clean for you. Now, what happens in Acts next is one of the most dramatic moments in church history. And this is Pentecost. And at Pentecost, Peter gives up to preach the sermon of the history of God's dealing with Israel, how he has called Israel, how he has worked through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and how he has called Moses to take them in. But the beginning of his sermon, some make fun of them because people hear tongues in their own ears. They hear their own language in their own ears. And they say, listen, these guys really must be drunk. They've had a little too much wine. And Peter responds, yeah, we're not drunk yet. We're drunk with new wine, because it's only 9 o'clock in the morning, and none of us go to the bars or the wells that early in the morning. What this is then is that we find that the world laughs at drunkards. And as Erasmus says, the apostles are, in a sense, drunk with the Holy Spirit. They are so intoxicated, they are so alive, and they are happy drunks that we see moving on there. Now, the next thing that happens, however, is that King Herod Agrippa, King Herod Agrippa kills James, the brother of John, one of the sons of thunder, with the sword. And he arrests Peter. Peter is put in prison, and he is there waiting and not knowing what's going to happen. But he unbelievably escapes from prison when an angel comes and puts everyone to sleep, and he directs them out. Now, this is the beginning of a kind of a setup of a comedy, and it's one of those kind of sandwiches where we have kind of a story and then something in the middle. What happens next is that he goes to the house of Mary, who is the mother of John Mark. Mark is our kind of comic writer of the Gospel of Mark, who's always talking about food. And he goes there, and the people had gathered to pray for Peter because they saw what happened to James. He'd been killed and assassinated, murdered, martyred. But now Peter's at the outer entrance, and a servant named Rhoda. Rhoda's a young woman, and she comes to the door, and she hears Peter's voice, and she gets really excited. She doesn't open the door, but she gets overjoyed, and she runs back and exclaims, just so giddy. She says, Peter's here. Peter's at the door. And those people who are sincerely praying says, no, you're out of your mind. Rhoda, you know what you're talking about, because we're praying for Peter. And God has not yet heard our prayers. She says, no, it is Peter. And she says, no, it must be his angel or something. You're having a vision. But Peter keeps knocking. He keeps knocking, and they finally open the door, and they are astonished to see him. It's just a wonderful comic moment. Now, the grand irony is next, because we then go back to Herod, King Herod Agrippa. And on this appointed day, Herod thinks he has won everything. He's wearing his royal robes, and he gives this address to the people. And it's one of the best speeches he given. And they shout, this is the voice of a God, not of a man. And immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord, could have been the same one that led Peter out, strikes him down, and he's eaten by worms and died. Now, usually I give you a picture of worms eating someone like that, but I'm going to avoid that today. Just you have the image of your mind that Herod does not end well. And this is the great irony of someone who thinks he's a god, and God uses that comic reversal to say, no, you are not in charge. Now, the next thing we see is that Peter was called to preach and to feed his lambs. Feed my sheep, Jesus says, and this becomes the call of all good clergy. Not to do experiments on them, not to kind of make them adapt to culture, but to preach a foolishness, the foolishness of the cross. To the Greeks who want knowledge, there's something you have to take a leap of faith to understand this folly, this foolishness. And Paul will use this word quite a bit. In fact, the next thing we see is that there is this wonderful tradition of holy fools. Throughout the church, it starts in Paul's letters to the church at Corinth. He says, if any man thinks you're wise in this world, become a fool. Become someone who can simply believe the evidence that you might be wise. In fact, we'll find the fools like St. Francis of Assisi, who prays in the midst of corruption, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. And where there is hatred, let me sow love. And the canticle of St. Francis will become something that teaches us how to be holy fools. Now, as Paul has written next, basically, the gospel is going to destroy the wisdom of the wise and the cleverness of the clever. Those things are no longer important. But he chooses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. Those who think they are in control of their lives are going to find a disaster. They're going to find that it leads to a dead end, that the roller coaster ride of life is going to end in the pit. But next we find in art, there is this wonderful tradition of Christ as the great holy fool, the clown of God who is there, who proclaims to us that we too can be redeemed, that he can take our lives and turn them around. This also comes out next in other kinds of literature. We find that Jesus is the holy fool, where both Roman Catholics and Lutherans and others celebrate that. And Tommy DePola took this ancient story of the little boy whose only gift was his ability to juggle, and how as the clown of God, he comes to Mary in the church, and he brings the statues to life, and to smile at his one simple gift. And Rolf Forsberg did an amazing film for the World's Fair back in 1964, in which he portrayed Christ as a clown who comes and dies for the people in the circus. And the ringmaster of the circus, the prince of the air, is Satan, and he tries to kill him, but the resurrection will still come out of this kind of joyful moment. In fact, next you may remember the kind of movie of Godspell. That Godspell finds that kind of joy where Jesus is dressed as a clown, but he is a serious comic. He is not someone who is just silly and flippant, but he is someone who brings joy. In fact, the next one of the great scenes of that is where Jesus says, some people read palms or tea leaves. He says, I read feet. Now notice the joke that we have even in the script by Stephen Schwartz is when he says, I read feet, it basically is, I read souls. I read your soul, and what has been implanted on your soul is rejoice. Be filled with joy. Laugh that is there. Now, next we move from kind of this overview of all of the Gospels. We remember from the beginning where Mary went to see Elizabeth, and this kind of prenatal leap for joy, that in the womb is so sacred. The child that is in a womb is this human being who already knows. And John the Baptist is in the womb of Elizabeth, and he is already jumping up and down, that he is going to prepare a way. He's going to make straight a path in the wilderness for this cousin of his. And then we move throughout the Gospels, and we find this rejoicing and leaping for joy in Luke and in Acts. In fact, one of my friends, Lyle Story, who teaches at Regent University, has just come out with a book that I highly recommend called Joyous Encounters. And it's discovering the kind of joy that God brings when people meet, when God meets people, that we are these sheep who just keep jumping and leaping and praising God. There's something wonderful in the encounter of God's people, not only with God, but with one another. We move from this joy, however, to Paul, who gets serious about some admonitions against humor. And during the early days of our courtship, this was a verse that my wife would repeat to me over and over again. And she would say, like Paul, let there be no filthiness or silly talk or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. Now, next, what I would do with her is I would bring out these words in the Greek and begin to explain to them that King James didn't really have the best interpretation. Ruperia, morologia, and eutropelia. These are words that Paul uses that have different meanings, and we've kind of maybe distorted them in certain translations. So the next thing I would get to is look at what C.S. Lewis says. When you're talking about coarse jesting, he says there are two ways to joke about sex. He writes this in his little kind of screw tape letters that came out in the early 1940s. And he says, there are those jests that really belittle and vulgarize sex. They excite lust and laughter at the same time. This is the kind of joking we should not do. This is the kind of coarse jesting. But there are jokes about sex that we can make. There's kind of a natural incongruity about the body, and we can laugh about the body and all the parts of the body. Paul himself talks about the unseemly members. He's talking about parts that we don't really show off, but are funny. And the human body is funny. And so we're allowed to kind of make jokes about gender, about sex, that are not, in one sense, disparaging it or vulgarizing it, but celebrating the comedy that is there. Lewis said, you try to banish play and laughter from the marriage bed, and you will let in a false goddess. This gets to these two words that we see up here now. First, moralogia. Mora comes from the word, means foolish or moron. Don't be a logia. Logia are words. So you have the words of a fool. And what are the words of a fool in the book of Proverbs? The words of a fool are, there is no God. So moralogia does not mean kind of silly talk, but it means basically foolish talk that denies God and his power. Do not make little of God's presence and power and his gospel. The other word is really interesting, eutrapelia. Eu, of course, means good. Eucatastrophe is a good catastrophe. It's a good thing that happens to us. But tropelia is an interesting Greek word because it can be translated two ways. It can be either a twisting or a turning. A twist and a turn are very similar. So if you use it like Paul does here, eutrapelia, it's a twisting of the good. It's taking something that's good and making it lewd, making it wrong. And this is not right. When you make fun of virtue, that is a twisting of the good. But a turning of the good, we're going to find St. Thomas Aquinas later on and many other kind of church fathers saying, we need this turning of the good. We need to be eutrapelia. And so you have to watch how this word is used in different contexts. Now, we get next to this idea of moralogia. There are fools or morons. And the Darwin Awards are given to people who are morons. These are the people who are so stupid and so foolish. It's an Ed McMahon joke. How stupid are they? We see that the Darwin Awards are given to people who begin to cut down the gene pool. We get the moron genes out of the gene pool because people do such stupid things, whether it's swinging into trees or getting in a tire that goes down the hill, keeps rolling and rolling and rolling, and could almost destroy this kind of stupid people there. But for the grace of God, these people live. But we find it next too in the people how they drive, the stupid people going out and not really paying attention to the laws there. It's people who don't wear masks when they should wear masks. These are stupid things. These are moron acts more than anything else. And the next one too is like sawing yourself off of a tree, sitting on the limb and sawing it off, or cutting off kind of the ice glacier and falling down, or being little boys putting explosives on a manhole cover. These things are moronic acts. These are things that are stupid. And the Darwin Award says basically we're getting rid of these people in the gene pool, so we might have somebody that's a little brighter in the next generation. Now we find in James too that he uses irony. James is a little more serious. James, the brother of Jesus, when he writes this. And he talks about the irony of good intentions. He says, for example, if one of you says to somebody who is cold, go in peace, keep warm, and be well fed, but you don't do anything physical about their needs, what good is it? And so Charles Schulz created this wonderful little Snoopy cartoon where Charlie and Linus come up and they say, Snoopy looks kind of cold, doesn't he? I'll say he does. Maybe we better go over and comfort him. So they go over and say, be of good cheer, Snoopy. Yes, be of good cheer. And then they walk away. They leave him cold. Now, this becomes kind of a story that all of us kind of may recognize in ourselves. I remember being in Chicago on a cold late November day, and I was walking with my friend Andrew Quick, and it was snowing, cold, and there was a homeless man who came up, and he said, "Would you give me some money?" And we kind of looked at him. We realized this guy is so drunk, but I kind of hesitated. But Andrew gave him some money, so I gave him some money too, and he said, "God bless you," as we walked away. And I said, "Andrew, don't you realize he's just going to take that money and go buy wine?" And Andrew says, "Well, we're Episcopalians. We do the same thing." And so it was really a matter of giving comfort to someone who needed it and letting God take care of the consequences. But it's there. We can't just say to one another, be of good cheer, be of good comfort, and walk away. We must do something physical. Next, we get to Paul. And here we have one of Paul's letters to Galatians. And he's basically telling Peter, don't be a hypocrite. When you're around the Gentiles, you'll eat non-kosher food, you'll drink, you'll be with these uncircumcised people. But when certain kind of religious, legalistic Christians come, you will leave these people that look sinful and you'll say, no, I can only be with the circumcised. And Paul is saying, no, circumcision doesn't matter. Look at Abraham. Before the law, Abraham was accepted by God because of his faith. This leads us to one of Paul's greatest puns, and it is a very incisive or cutting pun, because in Galatians, he talks about the circumcision party, this legalistic party that says you need to kind of cut it off. And he says, I wish those people who are commanding you to be circumcised would be cut off completely. Now, next, let's look at what that word means. He uses two words, peritome, which means to cut around. To kind of circumcise is to cut around the foreskin and cut it off. Katatome is the other word that Paul uses, which means to cut the darn thing off completely. Saw it, rip it off, use a knife, just cut it off and basically take the thing away. And so Paul is using this great pun distinction on the legalist, on the foolish Galatians, on circumcision. You say peritome, I say, if you want a peritome, why don't you katatome? That's it. Now, next we find that Paul said he did have a thorn in the flesh, and we still haven't discovered what that thorn in the flesh was. But some of us think it might have been SpongeBob SquarePants. Hey, Paul, what you doing? Right, daughter? Hey, Paul. There are those people in our lives that are the thorns in our flesh. And Paul tells us that God gives us grace to get through all of them. Now, finally, next, we get to what is known as judgment humor, where we look at the end times. And the book of Revelation and Jesus' discourse on Mount Olivet may give us kind of pause. But we have to think about the end times. And for Christians, this is a time that is good. For many people, Bill Gates going up, he finds that Peter's using an iPad. For others, we find that if they were a CEO of a company that did not help their workers, they're going to end up on the poop list. But we move on from there next to this idea that I had when I was a kid that I found kind of in a New York cartoon, is that before we get into heaven, we're going to have to watch a whole film of our life, and everybody else is going to see that film too. So take a moment and review, how is your life going to be rated? Not just what people have observed, but what is your thought life? And it gets a scary rating. Most of us are going to have X ratings, just for the kind of not just lust, but the hate and the envy and the sloth and the anger that we see. And this is going to be on the screen for everyone to see. Fortunately, Jesus comes along and he erases all of that. And so we get to see the story of Jesus in our lives, which is much better. Next, we find a parable of judgment, that what really it's going to be like. And it is in the Middle Ages where we get more this image of the fires of hell, Gehenna that is there. And so we look like these two eggs at one of our friends down there. But it gets worse in the next image, when you begin to realize where you're headed. And if the frying pan is there, it's not a good place to be. And you'll end up being like a marshmallow as well, kind of burnt to a crisp. But we get out of that and we look at this idea, which is a 19th century idea of the rapture. Now, there's going to be a second coming, we know. And the second coming, the Lord is going to take us to be with him. But the idea of the rapture came out of the 19th century, and a man named Darby, who began to think that God would take people away from suffering. And so here you notice that in this image, when the judgment comes, the people from the church run over for a drink, and the people from the bar realize, no, I better get over there and seek God. It's a frightful time. The next image shows us what happens in New York and Paris and everywhere else of how many people God is going to take up. Of course, when you're in Vegas, there's probably only one from Vegas that's going to be taken up there. But the final image next is, what is the end going to be like? What do the scriptures tell us the end is going to be? And it's going to be this marvelous feast, this banquet, this wedding feast where we all gather together. And it's the marriage of the Lamb where he receives us. And there's a time of such singing and joy and praising that is there. This leads us next to this final image where heaven is seen as a wedding. And the wedding has been prepared for us. And we only have to respond to the invitation. The poor, the lame, the crippled, the blind, each one of us sinners has been invited, and God is going to costume us. He's going to dress us up and bring us in. So what do we say in conclusion for all of this? It is the last thing we look at that is next. And this is my friend G.K. Chesterton, who influenced C.S. Lewis so much into his conversion. And he says, basically, this laughter of joy is the gigantic secret of the Christian. The tremendous figure that fills the gospel, who is Jesus, towers in this respect, as in every other, above all the thinkers who ever thought themselves tall. His pathos, his feeling was very natural, almost casual. The Stoics, ancient and modern, were proud of concealing their tears. He never concealed his tears. He showed them plainly on the open face at any daily sight, such as the far sight of his native city of Jerusalem. Yet he concealed something. Solemn supermen and imperial diplomats are proud of restraining their anger. He never restrained his anger. He flung furniture down in the front steps of the temple, and he asked men how they expected to escape the damnation of hell. Yet he restrained something. Next, he said, there was something that Jesus hid from all men and women when he went up to a mountain to pray. There was something that he covered constantly by abrupt silence or impetuous isolation. There was some one thing that was too great to God for God to show us when he walked upon the earth. And I have sometimes fancied that it was his mirth. This is the last thing that God has saved for us. He has shown us his anger. He has shown us his tears and sorrow. But he has not yet fully shown us his laughter. His laughter and his mirth and his joy are there, being held in preparation for the great wedding feast of the Lamb. And we have the invitation, and it's now just up to us to RSVP. Next week, we're going to look at how the church responded. And the church responded to the laughter being suspicious, but then embracing it. So I'll see you next week for the church, the early church, and laughter.